Mom smiled at Tina across the Thanksgiving table. Good thing your miscarriage spared our family from a failure. Relatives laughed, and my sister, holding her child, smirked. Only real mothers belong here. I clenched my fists and stood up. No one knew this would be the last Thanksgiving. Cleveland winter mornings always begin quietly. From Emily Watson's office window overlooking the snow-covered streets, she could see cars arriving one after another in the hospital parking lot. As a pediatrician with 10 years of experience, Emily was accustomed to this morning routine. However, everything had felt different these past few months. She reached for the picture frame on her desk, a photo from her wedding day with Daniel, both of them smiling, full of hope. Daniel, a successful corporate attorney, had always been her support, especially since that day. Emily unconsciously placed her hand on her abdomen. 5 months ago, they had lost their long-awaited baby, sudden abdominal pain followed by a long night at the hospital, then the doctor's apologetic expression. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "The first patient is ready," the nurse announced. Emily took a deep breath and regained her professional smile. This was her coping mechanism, immersing herself in work. Time for healing would come later. When Daniel returned home, they would find comfort in each other's arms. The office phone rang. Emily picked up the receiver. It's Mom." Emily closed her eyes. Her mother Margaret's voice always evoked a little tension. "Good morning. Do you need something? I just wanted to confirm about Thanksgiving. I've invited Daniel's mother too, since it's the first time I'll be meeting her. I want everything to be perfect." In Cleveland social circles, Margaret Thompson was a respected figure. As the owner of a high-end boutique chain, she always cared about appearances and reputation, and above all, she cherished the image of the perfect family. "You invited Daniel's mother?" Emily asked in surprise. "Yes, of course. She's part of our family, especially after the recent event. She seems to be looking after you." The event, her mother always referred to the miscarriage that way, as if it were an inconvenient accident, something that tarnished the family reputation. "Thank you. Grace is truly a wonderful person," Emily answered honestly. Daniel's mother, Grace Parker, was one of the most compassionate souls she had met after her miscarriage. As a local philanthropist, Grace was involved in many support activities for women and children, but more than that, she had offered Emily unconditional love and support. Unlike Margaret. "And Sophia and Henry are coming too. They're bringing little Oliver." Pride seeped into Margaret's voice. Emily's sister, Sophia, led the perfect life. Having inherited Margaret's values, Sophia was a stay-at-home mom with a 3-year-old son, always playing the role of the ideal mother. "How's Dad?" Emily asked about her father, Richard, the retired university professor who often seemed hidden in the shadow of her mother's strong personality. He seemed to protect himself from family tensions by retreating into his research and books. "Your father is the same, as always shut away in his study, not wanting to be disturbed by anyone." Margaret made no attempt to hide her irritation. After the conversation ended, Emily gazed out the window. Thanksgiving, a time for family gatherings. She should have been 7 months pregnant by now. She should have been celebrating with her family, feeling the baby move inside her. She took out her cell phone and sent a message to Daniel. "Mom invited Grace for Thanksgiving. Is that okay?" The reply came immediately. "Of course. We're a team. Let's get through this together." Emily smiled. Daniel was her rock through any storm. He stood by her side, and so did Grace. That evening, Emily and Daniel sat on the living room sofa, drinking wine and reflecting on the day. "I wonder why Mom suddenly invited Grace," Emily wondered. Daniel shrugged. "My mother was pleased. She's wanted to meet your family for a long time. But Thanksgiving is." Emily was choosing her words carefully. "Family gatherings can sometimes be tense, especially since Mom and Sophia don't have much understanding about our situation." Daniel squeezed her hand. "It'll be fine. My mother is on our side too. Whatever happens, we'll support each other." Emily leaned against him, finding comfort in his words. Anxiety remained deep in her heart. For years, she had endured subtle criticism and comparisons from her mother and sister criticism for prioritizing her medical career and not getting married at the right time. And now, after the miscarriage, how would they see her? The phone rang. It was Grace. "How about lunch together tomorrow? I have some business near your hospital," Emily smiled. Grace's timing was perfect, as if she always appeared when needed. "Yes, I'd love to." The next day, at a small cafe in town, Grace greeted Emily with a warm smile. An elegant yet down-to-earth woman, Grace's presence was always comforting. "Thank you for the Thanksgiving invitation," Grace said. "Your mother was very kind on the phone." Emily laughed. "That's Mom's social voice. She's desperate to maintain her reputation as the perfect hostess." Grace touched her hand. "Are you okay?" Thanksgiving can sometimes be emotional, especially this year. Emily took a deep breath. "To be honest, I'm a bit nervous. Mom and Sophia aren't very sympathetic about my miscarriage. For them, it seems like the result of my attachment to my career." "Nonsense," Grace said firmly. "You're a wonderful doctor, and someday you'll be a wonderful mother. Timing and method don't matter. What matters is love." At those words, tears welled in Emily's eyes. These were the words she needed: unconditional support, deep understanding. On Thanksgiving Day, Emily and Daniel arrived at the Thompsons' luxurious home. Opening the door, Margaret greeted them with perfect makeup and hair. Daniel, you're late," she said. Sophia was already playing with Oliver in the living room. She wore perfectly styled hair and an expensive cashmere sweater. "Is Grace here yet?" Emily asked. "Yes, she arrived on time," Margaret said with subtle sarcasm. As Emily and Daniel entered the living room, Grace stood up to warmly welcome them. She had apparently been playing on the floor with Oliver. Grace hugged them. "You finally made it." Sophia picked up her son and smiled. "It's been a while. You look good. Have you gained weight?" The first subtle blow. Emily maintained her smile and replied, "Work has been busy. I haven't had time to exercise." Richard emerged from his study and gently embraced his daughter. "I'm glad you came." There was genuine warmth in his eyes. Beneath the surface of calm conversation and smiles, Emily sensed cold glances from her mother and sister. These manifested as small sarcastic remarks, meaningful exchanges of glances, and subtle criticism of her profession. "Everyone, dinner is ready," Margaret announced with a perfect hostess smile. As the family moved to the dining room, Emily took a deep breath. It was going to be a long night. Daniel squeezed her hand and whispered, "We're in this together." Grace also sent her a reassuring smile. In the Thompson family dining room, a lavish Thanksgiving dinner was spread out. A crystal chandelier illuminated the table, and delicious aromas filled the room. Margaret began carving the turkey, and everyone offered words of praise. "This year's turkey looks especially delicious," Grace said. She elegantly raised her wine glass. "Thank you for the wonderful hospitality." Margaret smiled with satisfaction. "Thank you. Our Thanksgiving traditions are most important to our family. Let's make a toast." Richard raised his glass. "To family and health, and to gathering together again next year." The sound of glasses clinking rang out, and a moment of harmonious atmosphere flowed. Emily squeezed her husband's hand under the table. "So far, so good." "Emily, give me your plate." Margaret offered a slice of turkey. As Emily extended her plate, Margaret paused and looked her up and down. "Have you gained weight recently? You're not pregnant anymore. You should be careful." A moment of silence fell over the table. Daniel's hand tightened on Emily's thigh. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Margaret," Richard said warningly. Margaret shrugged. "What?" "It's a mother's duty to worry about her daughter." Emily took a deep breath and smiled. "Thank you, but I'm satisfied with my body." In the tense atmosphere, Sophia giggled while stroking her son's hair. "Mom, don't say such things." "But we mothers always have to think about our children." Those words were like salt in the wound. Emily tried to continue eating in silence. Her hands trembled slightly. Oliver has already started preparing for kindergarten. Sophia changed the topic to her son. The teachers say he's extremely intelligent. He must take after Grandpa. Richard smiled gently at his grandson. He's a wonderful child. Emily, Margaret suddenly said, are you and Daniel trying to have another child? Emily struggled to swallow the food in her mouth. Mom, that's a private matter between us. Of course it is, but as family, I worry. You're already 35. Time is ticking away. Grace quietly spoke up. Margaret, that's a bit, but Margaret waved her hand to silence her. As the mother of an only son, you might understand, but as the mother of 2 daughters, I wish for their happiness. Margaret took her wine glass and slowly swirled the wine. Actually, I've been thinking about your incident. Emily froze. Incident? Your miscarriage, Margaret said frankly. As a doctor, you should have understood the risks, long working hours, stress, and… She searched for words. Well, your age too. Emily's voice trembled. Please, not now. But Margaret continued with a smile. In a way, your miscarriage might have been a blessing for the family. To be honest, Emily, you've always been so focused on work. I didn't think you were ready to be a mother. We've been spared having a defective addition to the family. Relatives around the table laughed awkwardly. Richard covered his face with his hands, and Grace's face reddened with anger. Sophia hugged her son and smirked. I guess only real mothers belong here. Emily's hands shook, gripping the cutlery tightly. The world seemed to spin slowly in her head, the life she had lost from her body, the countless nights she had cried, and now even her identity as a mother was being denied. Slowly, she rose from her chair. The room was suddenly filled with tension. Daniel quietly called her name. Emily didn't move. She stared at her mother, the face of Margaret, aged but still beautiful, the woman she had admired, loved, and sometimes feared. Daniel stood up and placed his hand on his wife's shoulder. His eyes were cold as he stared at his mother-in-law. Margaret, either you take back what you just said or we're leaving. Margaret looked surprised. Well, Daniel, I merely spoke the truth. As family, shouldn't we be honest? That's not honesty. It's cruelty. Grace also stood up. Her voice was quiet but filled with strong will. I didn't expect Thanksgiving in this house to be so cold. Sophia rolled her eyes. Please, everyone's overreacting. Mom is just concerned. Emily finally spoke. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. For 2 years, Daniel and I wanted a baby. The day I miscarried, I felt like I had failed as a doctor, as a woman, and as a potential mother. But now I realize it wasn't me who failed, but you. You failed to show love and support. Margaret tried to speak, but Emily raised her hand to stop her. The words you said across the table tonight weren't just opinions. They dismissed my pain, invalidated my experience, and, worst of all, they insulted the life I lost. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she stood strong. Daniel and Grace supported her on either side. Mom, we're leaving. And tomorrow, please think about what you said tonight. I love you, but right now, I can't forgive you. She quietly placed her napkin on the table and left the dining room, with Daniel and Grace behind her. Margaret sat in shock. The morning after Thanksgiving, Daniel's figure entering the Cleveland high-rise was clearly different from usual. His expression was etched with anger and determination as he headed to his law firm's floor in the elevator. The events of last night wouldn't leave his mind, the pained expression on his wife's face, her mother's cruel words, and Margaret Thompson's cynical smile. Dan, I thought today was a holiday, his colleague Michael said with a surprised look. I have an urgent case, Daniel answered concisely. Could you book a meeting room and please call Karen from the tax department? And David from corporate? Michael raised an eyebrow but nodded without questioning. Has something special happened? Daniel exhaled deeply. Yes. It's related to how my wife was treated by her family at Thanksgiving yesterday. Are you going back to the Thompson Boutiques case? Michael's eyes widened. Yes, Daniel replied calmly. I've kept my distance out of consideration for my mother-in-law, but now it's time to apply the law fairly. In the meeting room, gathered before the lawyers, Daniel calmly explained. Margaret Thompson's company, Thompson Boutiques, had long-standing legal concerns issues with employee working conditions, contracts with business partners, and tax processing irregularities. Until now, out of consideration for his mother-in-law, he had assigned this case to other colleagues. But from today, I will personally handle this case, he declared with a stern expression. I will thoroughly examine all evidence and take legal action if necessary. No personal feelings will be involved. We will proceed purely from a legal standpoint. At the same time, in another part of Cleveland, Grace was attending an emergency board meeting of the local women's support organization. Dressed in an elegant suit, Grace entered the meeting room with a face full of stern determination rather than her usual calm expression. Thank you all for gathering today, she said to the seated board members. I feel I must raise an important issue before our organization selects its next chairperson. The board members looked at Grace with curious eyes. She was one of the most respected figures in Cleveland's charity circles. Her words carried weight. I am aware that Margaret is a candidate for the next chairperson, she continued matter-of-factly. However, we need to carefully consider whether she truly aligns with our mission and values. Grace explained the events of last night's Thanksgiving in detail, controlling her emotions, Margaret's cruel words to a woman who had experienced a miscarriage and the meaning behind those words. Our organization's mission is to support and respect all women. Grace's voice was quiet but powerful. I don't think it's appropriate for someone who insults women who have experienced miscarriage to be the representative of an organization that advocates for women's support. Meanwhile, Emily was examining patients at the hospital, as usual. However, her heart was not at peace. Last night, after returning home, she had finally released the emotions she had been holding for years, crying in Daniel's arms. She spoke about the verbal violence from her mother and her sister's betrayal. A nurse gave a small knock at her office. Dr. Emily, your mother is on the phone. Emily took a deep breath and picked up the receiver. It's Mom. Margaret's voice sounded more anxious than usual. I want to talk about last night. I'm at work now, Emily replied calmly. And what you said isn't easily forgotten. You're being too sensitive. I was simply, Emily interrupted her. I'm at work, and honestly, I'm not ready to talk to you yet. Please give me time. She hung up and gazed out the window. For the first time, she felt the need to free herself from the toxicity of her mother and sister. Several weeks passed, and the situation rapidly developed. Margaret's company suddenly faced tax audits and workplace environment inspections. Though Daniel appeared uninvolved on the surface, he was providing legal support to whistleblowers, arranging for the company's misconduct to come to light one after another. This is a business matter, he explained to his wife. If she broke the law, she should face it. At the same time, Margaret's position in social circles began to waver. The issue raised by Grace was seriously discussed within women's support organizations, and as a result, Margaret had to voluntarily withdraw from the next chairperson election. Furthermore, she was pressured to resign from other organizations where she served as a board member, citing personal circumstances. One night, as Emily and Daniel were enjoying dinner, the doorbell rang. Opening the door, Sophia stood there. Her eyes were red, and her makeup was smudged. Please hear me out, she pleaded. Emily hesitated for a moment, but invited her sister in. In the living room, Sophia explained the situation through tears. Her husband Henry's company had close ties with Margaret's boutique, and was also affected by the current investigation, and the family's reputation was rapidly declining in the community. Mom cries every day, Sophia said. She believes this is all your revenge, Em. Please stop this. Emily calmly looked at her sister. Sophia, this isn't revenge. These are consequences of Mom's actions and your words. But we're family, Sophia cried out. Yes, family, Emily said quietly. On Thanksgiving night, you and Mom insulted the child I lost, and now you're asking for help. Is that what family means? Sophia fell silent. For the first time, an expression of understanding appeared on her face. Before Christmas, Margaret finally called Emily directly. Her voice had lost its former strength and confidence. "Please, let's discuss how to resolve this situation," she begged. "I want the whole family to gather for Christmas." "I'm sorry, but I'll be spending this Christmas with my new family," Emily replied calmly. "New family?" Margaret's voice trembled. "Daniel and Grace and the children from the orphanage Grace supports," Emily explained. "We plan to distribute presents and have dinner together. This is the form of family I've been seeking, a place where people support and love each other." After hanging up, Emily gazed at the snowy landscape outside the window. Her heart held both pain and a sense of liberation and expectation for new possibilities. She and Daniel had begun discussing the possibility of adoption. Grace had taught them about children who needed loving homes. "Our family is determined by love, not blood ties," Emily whispered quietly. In the season of melting snow, Ohio's spring arrived late. In the garden of Emily's home, small buds began to emerge from the soil, announcing the beginning of new life. She stood by the living room window, holding a document in her hand. "The review has been approved." She turned back and smiled at Daniel. "We're officially candidates for adoption." Daniel embraced his wife. "Wonderful! Let's open champagne." At that moment, Emily's smartphone rang, and Sophia's name appeared on the screen. Emily sighed. Since Christmas, she had minimized contact with her birth family, just short conversations and superficial greetings. On the other end of the phone, her sister was crying. "Please help. Mom's company has filed for bankruptcy, and Henry's company has also taken a big hit." Her voice trembled. "We might lose our home." Emily gazed out the window. Her life had just begun to move forward. She and Daniel were preparing to welcome twin girls, Chloe and Mia, into their family. Was she really ready to reopen past wounds? "I'll talk to Daniel," she finally said. "But I can't make any promises." After hanging up, Emily explained the situation to Daniel. He considered carefully and finally suggested consulting with Grace as well. The next day, Grace quietly listened while drinking coffee at Emily's house. "Whatever you decide, I support you," she finally said. "But remember one thing: forgiveness is not for the other person, but for yourself." On the weekend, an unfamiliar car stopped in front of Emily and Daniel's house. Margaret and Sophia got out. No longer with their confident appearance, both looked tired. Margaret's high-end brand clothes weren't worn as perfectly as before, and Sophia's face showed deep worry. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said with a nervous smile. Emily quietly welcomed the two. "Please come in." Grace was already seated in the living room. Margaret hesitated for a moment but sat down. Tension permeated the room. "Something to drink?" Emily asked. "No, thank you," Margaret answered in a small voice. She was clearly uncomfortable. "I came to talk directly because you are our last hope." Emily sat quietly, and Daniel came to her side. "Can you explain what you mean?" Margaret and Sophia took turns explaining the situation. Thompson Boutiques had to pay a large fine as a result of the tax audit and had fallen into excessive debt. Sophia's husband, Henry, had also lost investments due to the company connection, and now their foundation of life was about to collapse. "Daniel, you have funds, don't you? Could you lend us some?" The room fell silent. Emily stared at her mother and sister. The words from Thanksgiving night came to mind: defective, real mother. The people who had uttered such words were now asking for help. "Why should I help?" Emily quietly asked. "On Thanksgiving night you mocked my pain. You called the child I lost it defective. Why should I help such people?" Sophia began to cry. "I was wrong that night. I said things I shouldn't have. But think about Oliver, he's still so young." Margaret also had tears in her eyes. "Emily, she struggled for words. "I was wrong. I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't mean to hurt me?" Emily's voice rose slightly. "Is that really what you think?" Margaret took a deep breath and closed her eyes. "I was jealous," she finally admitted. jealous that you succeeded as a doctor, chose your own path, and lived ignoring my advice that you refused to live like me." The room fell silent again. Emily was surprised by her mother's confession. She had always thought her mother was disappointed in her, that she wasn't perfect like her mother. But in reality, her mother had been jealous of her independence. Emily said in a calm voice, "As you said, only real family belongs here. But real family isn't about blood relations. It's about relationships where people respect and support each other." She gave Daniel a look. He stood up and brought documents from the study. "What is this?" Margaret asked, looking at the documents. "This is a proposal to take over Margaret's company's debt," Daniel explained. "As a lawyer, we will acquire and rebuild the company. Employee jobs will be maintained, and the brand name will continue. However, there are several conditions." Margaret and Sophia stared at the documents with expressions mixing hope and fear. "What kind of conditions?" Margaret asked in a low voice. Emily leaned forward. "First, you and Sophia will volunteer at a support group for women struggling with miscarriage or infertility at least 8 hours a week for 1 year." "Volunteer?" Sophia asked with a confused expression. "Yes, at the organization Grace runs," Emily explained. "There, you will listen to women who have experienced miscarriage or cannot have children and learn how to support them. And second," Daniel continued, "officially apologize to Emily and to all women who have had similar experiences." Margaret clutched the documents. Her hands were trembling. She seemed to be struggling between pride and necessity. "Give me time," she finally said, "until tomorrow." Emily calmly replied, "This is your last chance. Whether we can become a true family depends on you from now on." After Margaret and Sophia left, Emily faced Grace and Daniel. "Did I do the right thing?" she asked anxiously. Grace took her hand. "People can change, but sometimes forced learning is necessary. You gave them a chance to change. That's the greatest gift." That night, Emily gazed at photos of the twins waiting for adoption, contemplating the future to come, a new form of family, not connected by blood but bound by love and the possibility of healing a wounded past and building new bonds. The next morning, her smartphone rang. It was a message from Margaret. "I accept the conditions, and I sincerely apologize." Emily took a deep breath. This wasn't an end, but a new beginning. A year later, Cleveland was again in the Thanksgiving season. Warm light illuminated Emily and Daniel's home, and the aroma of turkey and pumpkin pie wafted from the kitchen. In the living room, 7-year-old twin girls, Chloe and Mia, were laughing while reading a picture book. It had been 6 months since they became a family. "Everyone will be here soon," Emily said, removing her apron. "Is everything ready?" Daniel nodded, while giving the turkey its final touches. "Perfect!" Grace said she'd come a bit early, so it should be any minute now. The doorbell rang, and the twin girls shouted, "Grandma," as they rushed over. Opening the door, Grace stood with presents in both hands. "My lovely granddaughters!" She embraced the girls. Next to arrive were Margaret and Sophia, along with her son, Oliver. Compared to a year ago, they had changed considerably. Margaret had a softer expression, and her former obsession with perfect appearances had receded. Sophia also carried a more gentle atmosphere. Margaret said a bit nervously. "I brought this." What she offered was a homemade apple pie. The former Margaret would have brought a perfect dessert bought from a high-end shop. "Thank you," Emily smiled as she accepted it. "Homemade?" Margaret nodded, looking a bit embarrassed. "I've been learning to cook with the women from the support group. They teach me many things." As everyone gathered at the dining table, a completely different atmosphere from last year spread. Instead of tension and sarcasm, there was a quiet warmth and air of reconciliation. During the prayer before the meal, Margaret began to speak through tears. "What I've learned this past year is what family means, not blood ties, but bonds where we respect each other and support one another during difficult times." She looked into Emily's eyes. "Emily, Daniel, and Grace, thank you for teaching me this important lesson." She continued further, "And through spending time with women struggling with miscarriage and infertility, I've learned the power of words. Words can heal, but they can also deeply hurt. My words last year were unforgivable. Hugging her twin daughters, Emily smiled and said, "This is the true meaning of our last Thanksgiving, the end of hatred and prejudice, and the beginning of new understanding and love." After dinner, Emily went into the garden with her mother. In the twilight, the fall foliage glowed beautifully. "How is Thompson Boutiques?" Emily asked. Margaret smiled. "It's moving in a new direction now. We have a concept of clothes for all women, creating clothes for diverse body types and needs. It's a small change, but a big step." "And your activities at the Community Support Center?" "That became my salvation," Margaret answered honestly. "By talking with women struggling with miscarriage and infertility, I confronted my own prejudices and learned true empathy. Now I'm also training in counseling 2 days a week." As the sun set, Emily looked over her family. Grace was reading a book with the twin girls, and Daniel and Sophia were discussing plans for the next holiday for the children. Father Richard, with his peaceful, retired expression, also joined the conversation. Her heart was fulfilled. This was the true image of family, not perfection, but acceptance and understanding, not criticism, but support and love, and above all, the courage to embrace growth and change. "Mom, thank you," Emily said quietly, "for changing." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand and smiled with gratitude.